youth and young adults in a multi-religious world. All of us at Union Presbyterian Seminary are glad you have joined us for this unprecedented virtual version of an annual event. While we wish we could be physically present with you in Richmond, we are happy that going digital has allowed many of you who could not typically participate in person to join us online. I am Karen Marie Youst, the Josiah P. and Ann Wilson Rowe Professor of Christian Education at UPSim, and I will be your host for this lecture. As in previous lectures, participants are invited to post questions during the lecture via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. I will be monitoring the Q&A box and sharing your questions with our speaker, either during this session or during the panel conversation later today. You will also have the opportunity to participate in some quick polls during today's presentation. So I encourage you to have either your smart handy or a second window open on your laptop or tablet so you can quickly access the polling site when those times come. As we prepare to listen to this morning's lecture, I invite you to join me now in prayer. God of all relationships, we give you thanks that you are in relationship with us and desire to hold us close. We acknowledge the grief and pain that has resulted from the distance we put between ourselves and you, as well as the distancing that we maintain among ourselves for the health and well-being of all. No matter the obstacles, help us to seek ways of nurturing and sustaining relationships, both divine and human. May the words this morning assist us in this commitment. Amen. Our lecturer this morning is someone whose work I have appreciated for over a quarter century. Dr. Eugene Roehlkepartain is Vice President of Research and Development for Search Institute, a research organization dedicated to creating a world where all young people are valued and thrive. I discovered Gene and Search Institute while I was serving as an associate pastor for Christian education in Boston. Back then, Search was producing resources related to asset building, and my congregation was excited to be part of a constructive network supporting the positive development of children and youth. Several years later, I worked with Gene co-editing a book titled Nurturing Child and Adolescent Spirituality, Perspectives from the World's Religious Traditions. That was part of a global research project on young people's spirituality that Gene led. He's also the author of The Teaching Church, Moving Christian Education to Center Stage, and editor of the Handbook of Spiritual Development in Childhood and Adolescence. The last 2 years, he has been directing a study exploring faith nurturing relationships in diverse congregations, and that work informs his presentation today. Dr. Roehlkepartain has a doctorate in education with a focus on the ecology of family, youth, and community development in relation to curriculum and instruction. His attention to diversity in spiritual development and faith is partially due to spending his childhood in Tanzania and Kenya as the child of missionaries. He and his wife Jolene live in the Minneapolis area and have 2 young adult sons, Micah and Eli. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roehlkepartain as he talks with us about intentional relationships, the heart of forming faith. Welcome, Gene.
Thank you, Karen Marie. It is delightful to be with you, and I appreciate your gracious introduction and your long friendship, which amazingly has survived editing a book together. I regret that I'm not in Richmond, of course, so we could catch up a little bit more, but we will find more ways to conspire, I am sure. Thank you to our colleagues at your colleagues at the seminary for this honor, President Blount, Clay McCauley, and the whole team at the seminary's alumni office. Thank you for everything you've done and the hospitality, even at a distance. I also really want to thank my fellow speakers, Evelyn Parker and Alan Cole. It's really been a pleasure and honor to share this series with you, to get to know you a little bit, even at a distance. and to really, I appreciate your contributions to the field as a whole, and youth and young adult scholarship. So we're all indebted to you for this. As Karen Marie mentioned, we will be doing a couple of polls during this session, and so you could have another browser open or another window or a cell phone to do that. We'll have a little fun with that. I do have a handout that's related to this. I couldn't figure out all technology to make that work. We'll have a website that you can link to that I'll have at the end of the session that you can have access to all of that material. So don't fret. You don't need it during the session, but it might be useful to you afterwards. So you're welcome to that. We'll stop it a couple of times for some questions and other things that you can connect with us. So isn't this an odd time to be talking about relationships in churches, mosques, and synagogues? We're protecting ourselves from each other, from the possibility that someone on the street, the grocery store, the pew next to us might be the source of a deadly infection. In fact, staying away from each other or social distancing is the best way to take care of each other. That's why I'm home in Minnesota and you're scattered around the country or the globe. And yet it's also important, even this critical time, to reflect on relationships and faith now in the lives of young people. Though the headlines focus most often on the pandemic's effect on the economy, healthcare, and politics, we also deeply experience how it isolates us from each other. We sometimes drawing out deepest fears and anxiety. It also focuses us to be together in ways that sometimes tear us apart, as Dr. Parker powerfully articulated yesterday. We yearn for times when we can be in fellowship. We grieve the losses we're born in isolations. We worry about friends, neighbors, family, and even ourselves who struggle with anxiety, depression, and other challenges that come in this time of social distancing and isolation. Yes, we know intellectually that the divine is present in solitude and where two or three are gathered, even if they are your teenagers. And we miss the gathered communities that we call churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples, those spiritual communities that give us rhythm to our days and weeks. We're glad to go to Zoom or Facebook Live Church or drive-through confession, but it's just not the same. So what we're experiencing now in a new way, each other's absence in ways that remind us that we are important to each other. But what does it really mean? What does it really look like? And dare I say it, are we perhaps the religious professionals and groupies maybe projecting our own attitudes and interests on everybody else? Maybe today's young people and families are incredibly happy to have another good reason not to have to show up at church. In fact, some observers quip that many people, perhaps the young people, won't miss church at all. In the 20 years since today's high school seniors were born, according to Gallup, the proportion of adults who claim no religious affiliation more than doubled from 8 to 19% between 1998 and 2018. Furthermore, these young people who are supposed to walk across the graduation stage this year not only can't remember a world without internet, they can't remember a world without 9/11, text messages, iPods, Britney Spears, or SpongeBob SquarePants. Heaven help them. Maybe just a creative meme about Zoom church will suit them just fine. Perhaps it would be satisfying enough for them. Kind of like an order of chicken McNuggets might be satisfying for a little while. But our research at Search Institute and the research of insights of many others suggests that the potential for nourishing faith and spiritual lives of young people within local congregations is so much greater than that. However, reaching that potential will be both frustratingly simple and frustratingly difficult, particularly in the light of recent trends and expectations. It won't be achieved if we just get back to whatever we were doing before the pandemic. This historical disruptive moment, which will define this generation's memory, invites us to reflect on how we will think about relationships, faith nurture, young people, and community. It asks us to reconsider our roles individually and collectively in living into the new patterns that will integrate faith, life in deep intentional relationships within and across generations and within and beyond congregations. So this morning, I'd like to invite you in the next few minutes, to explore some new territory together. Some of you, it won't be new territory. Some of you have spent a great deal of time there. And so let's just see what happens when we do this. Let me share my screen here. What I'd like to do is to use as our primary guides the youth, parenting adults, and leaders in the congregations where we've been spending a lot of time in the last couple of years, listening to them, finding out from them what really matters to them. We did through this qualitative study we did with the Lilly Endowment support. I'll start by grounding my presentation in the study that this grows out of. Last year, our team at Search Institute collected qualitative data from 13 diverse congregations, churches, mosques, and synagogues in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area and in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. We wanted to know how young people in a variety of wide range of faith traditions, cultures, sizes, and locations of congregations experience relationships, and how those relationships shape their faith and spiritual lives. Most of the congregations and focus group participants are shown in the handout, but it was a really nice diverse sample in terms of cultural groups, religious traditions, and size and types of congregations. We selected the congregations through a networking process. They weren't intended to be representative, and nor were they intended to be exemplary in any way. They were just a diverse network of congregations, a nice big size. We had 1,000 pages of transcripts from the qualitative data we gathered and then analyzed. And so as you'll see here, we had 8 Christian congregations, 3 synagogues, and two mosques in a variety of settings, 9 in cities, 2 in suburban areas, and 2 in rural areas, 218 focus group participants, and in a variety of backgrounds, largely youth in those samples. We do thematic analysis for those of you who are interested, where we start with open coding, where we don't have presumptions about it. We code it in software and then gradually move up to themes, and the themes are some of the things we'll be presenting today. And if you want to, we could spend hours talking about the slide, but we won't do that this morning. Out of that research, there were essentially 6 guiding questions, and we're going to talk about each of these a little bit this morning. First, what do faith nurturing relationships look like? Who builds those relationships? Why are those relationships important? Where are they built? When are they built? And how are they built? And so that will guide us through the morning. So to start with the first question, what do they look like? I want to ask a sort of a rhetorical question. Consider a seedling. What would it take for the seedling to grow into a full-size plant or tree? And if we had a morning, we would sit around tables and we'd brainstorm that. We'd have sticky notes or something. But just think about it for a minute. What would it take? And you can imagine the kind of sunlight, the rain, the nutrients that are in the soil, all kinds of things that would happen. And we'd have a nice, big, fancy sticky wall that would tell us all that. And then we would ask the question, so how do most of those needed nutrients get through that soil into the plant so it can grow and nourish and flourish? And then we would think about, well, some of it comes through the leaves, but the vast majority of it comes through the roots in the soil and through the roots into the tree that nourish that roots. So at Search Institute, we think about relationships as being like the roots of development. They're the things through which young people, all of us, get the foundation out of which everything grows and life thrives. And actually, it's very difficult to grow without roots. And so for us, we've been thinking about what needs to be in those roots. What kind of roots do we need in order to really thrive? And our work over the last 8 years has been identifying what makes relationships developmental. What's at the root of relationships to help young people thrive and grow. And so we've identified 5 elements of a developmental relationship. And if you get our handout, there's more definition of this and what's underlying these 5 elements. But this is what these are 5 elements are there. What we did is when we went into the congregations, we asked young people about people who helped them grow in their faith and what those people did. And we didn't start with this framework. We started with an open-ended set of questions. And what happened was these were ideas that we have been working on and grown out of our research. And what we found was the things that young people talked about in congregations were almost the very same kind of things we've been talking about with young people in schools, youth organization, and families about what were the things that helped them grow up and thrive and learn and make a difference in their lives. So that's where we started. And so what we're going to do today is I'm not going to give examples of all of the different things that kids said in general made them grow up. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on some of the faith-specific things that they talked about in these congregations and add them to the general framework. So we'll talk about the general framework and then also just add some of the faith-specific components that they mentioned that we wouldn't have found in other settings. So first of all, it's also important to say that the youth in the study who experienced these in their relationships also then talked about how they grew in their faith through these relationships. So just to make that connection, we'll talk more about that in a minute. So, and then one other final thing is when we showed the framework after conversations about it to the parenting adults and leaders, they said this would help them be more intentional to have this kind of a conversation starter, a guide to think about what kind of relationships that they could build with young people through congregations. So the first element we always talk about is expressing care. And we all know that care matters and we all say we care. And so a key word oftentimes is expressing care. There's probably lots of jokes about Oli and Lena or some other, whoever person is in your culture about you have to know I cared because I've been here for 30 years but I never bothered to say it. So anyway, expressing care, showing each other that we matter to each other, being dependable, listening, believing in each other, being warm, all the kinds of things that create a caring culture, climate, caring relationship. And there are quotes that are going to be on the side of each of these. I'm not going to read those. I'll trust that you can read those if you're interested in those. So the young people talked about dozens of ways that people showed them they cared and expressed their care in their congregations. We also heard many very faith-specific ways that they talked about it. Things like they prayed with me and for me. They also talked about being easy to talk to about faith and life, that integration of faith and life, and how that was so important. One of the young people said he was someone I could pray with, and I felt like I was praying with him for people who I loved, really made a difference, at least in my world. So the idea that there were people in the congregation that they could have those conversations with that maybe others, that they couldn't have other places. And that really mattered to them. The second area was challenging growth, of pushing each other to keep getting better. And the idea here is not pushing you to be what I want you to be, but pushing you to be who you want to be, who you're called to be, who your best self is. And so the idea of expect me to be my best, stretch me, hold me accountable to the things I said I would do, and help when I fail, when I don't reach a goal, help me reflect on that. And so those are the kind of things that they talked about as being that are actually critical, that we don't, in parenting, we know is both important to show care and also then to have high expectations. And this is what we've talked about, and it's also true as teachers. I was struck by one of our advisors in this project, Lisa Kimball, who is at Virginia Theological Seminary. In my interview with her, she talked about if we don't have adults who are able to share and give testimony to their own faith, they cannot nurture another person, another generation. They don't have anything to say. And kids know that. And kids know that mom and dad are driving me to church because they don't know how to talk about this stuff and they want somebody else to do it. So where does it happen? It happens best when it's in real relationships being formed. So soccer coaches are really good soccer coaches, but who take kids' whole person seriously and let young people talk through what's happening in the world right now. And so as she's talking about the way we challenge growth is to be able to fully engage. And the way to fully engage is when we're growing and learning and knowing as adults ourselves. So Lisa says, so there's 2 mass shootings within 24 hours. We're on the way to a soccer game. What are you all thinking about? What does it shake you? Are you angry? Are you afraid? Where do you lean for confidence, for hope, security? We need more adults who are willing to ask these kind of questions in the daily emotions of life. So I think it can happen on buses on the way to games. I think it should happen at the dinner table. And so it's fine to say we're challenging growth and expecting people to stretch and grow and learn. But how do we do that in a way if we're not able to also do that around the questions of faith? ourselves as adults. So how do we, the young people talked about encouraging participation, pushing me to go deeper in my faith and thinking about choices from a faith-based lens. The Muslim youth talked a lot about this as one of the things that really mattered to them in terms of how they grew and learned in their faith. So challenging growth, the second area, if we think about a well-rounded holistic relationship that goes beyond caring, but it includes caring. The third area of a well-rounded faith nurturing relationship is providing support. Again, if you think about care as being one side of it around the emotional support and being there for someone, this is more the practical, instrumental, or informational support, helping them complete goals and tasks, helping them navigate systems, helping them deal with the challenges that are around them, empowering them, advocating for them when they need that, setting boundaries so they stay on track. All of those kinds of things that happen. People need guides, mentors to help them through things, figure out stuff out. And that's a big part of the providing support. The young people in this study talked a lot about giving them guidance, helping them figure out their beliefs and thinking through stuff, making connections between religious teachings and life. All of those kinds of things around supporting them in their faith journey. The fourth dimension of a well-rounded relationship would be, how do we share power? How do we treat each other with respect and give each other a say? And you'll notice all of these I'm trying to frame in bidirectional, because the relationships are bidirectional, that it's not just what the adult does to or for the young person, but how do we, in relationship, help each other out and do these things back and forth. So how does the young person respect the adult and the adult respect the young person? How do we include each other in what's going on? How do we collaborate? How do we let each other lead in different spaces? And so this is a really important one. It's often one that kids struggle with to figure out where it's happening. Sometimes congregations are one of the few places where young people have leadership roles. So that's also important to know that it's a real resource. We hear that a lot in many different places where we visit. The young person's quote from during Ramadan, Muslim kids talking about how their teammates and others supporting them during Ramadan when they're fasting so that they can have the breaks that they need. And so when it comes to faith things, they talked about how how others would respect their beliefs and customs, honoring their faith journey, and really giving them a voice in not cramming things down their throat, frankly, but giving them a way to say they can own their own faith and find their own path with support in context of expressing care, in context of challenging growth, in context of all the other parts of a well-rounded faith nurturing relationship. Again, all of these have to fit together for it to really work. So then the final of the elements in a developmental faith nurturing relationship is the idea of expanding possibilities. How do we connect each other with ideas, people, and places that enlarge our worlds, where we inspire them to think about their future, broaden their horizons to think of new things, connect them with new people and places, to open up their minds to new ways of practicing their faith, to living out their faith, all of those kinds of things. And again, this is part of what we do generally in life. Think about all the people who've introduced you to new things, or all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I think about all the kinds of music my kids have introduced me to through the years, for example, just in general. And then faith-specific ways, the ways that the young people talked about individuals who's inspired them with a passion for faith, broadened their knowledge about religion, invited them to participate in new things. And so many of them talked about the importance of those invitations to how they learned about and got involved in different types of faith experiences for them, and how critical that was. One person said that every time that I think every person who's had a significant impact on my religious relationship has always drawn me in and included me in something, whether it's bringing me to a small group or into the parish. They brought me to something like, hey, come join us. And so for me, that was really part of the sense that young people like to be with their friends, and the idea that coming with me was a big part of the whole story there for them. So that was the first one. How do we begin moving our mental model from the idea that relationships just really are about love and care? We just have to love our kids and care for them. Everything will be fine. And that to moving to a much broader understanding of relationships being multidimensional, bidirectional, really, as they are, relationships are kind of complex things. How do we begin to understand that faith nurturing relationships are broader experiences and that we have to work on them? We have to be intentional about them. And we don't just need to have somebody who loves kids go out and hang out with kids, although that's a good thing. We need to think about how we're intentional about all the dimensions of the relationships that our kids have in their lives and how that those are formed and nurtured intentionally so that they're developmental, so that it's developing faith, not just hanging out because we're having a good time. And so that's part of what we're doing here is how do we think about what kinds of relationships do young people need and how are we doing that? Because if relationships are the roots of faith and if they are how faith is formed, then that's an important thing for us to figure out as how we do that. And if you get the handout, we have some other principles about how we think about relationships and what's underneath them and how they work. So, Karen Marie, I'm going to stop there and I flew through that. There's a lot there. We do day-long workshops on it. But are there any clarifying questions that we need to pick up on before we move forward?
I do have one question that might be useful because I imagine a bunch of people are thinking this. The question is relationships take time. And knowing that youth are so heavily scheduled, how do we form serious relationships in what feels like shorter and shorter time, particularly a multidimensional, bidirectional relationship? So maybe you can say a bit more about the relationship of time to these various aspects.
Yeah. How do we do this in shorter and shorter time? Well, sometimes these things don't take a lot of time. A lot of times, I mean, I'll just give it a quick example. We did a study in a school district where the gap between what teachers thought about relationships between teachers and students, what kids thought, was very, very different. And that was the first thing that teachers said: we don't have time to have relationships with all of our students. And so I'd spent a day with the teachers and the students in a session together, saying, okay, let's work on this. And first, the teachers went off and said all the stuff they thought, were thinking and worried about, and what they wanted and what the students wanted. And what ended up happening when they got back together, the students actually wanted some very simple things as a starting point. Don't diss me. Look me in the eye when you see me. Remember my name, this kind of stuff. And so when you're talking about a relationship, it doesn't necessarily have to mean you're spending 6 hours a week together. It can start with just beginning to notice kids, paying attention to them, valuing them, remembering things from the last time you saw them. Yes, they do need some intense relationships, but not everybody has to have an intense relationship with every kid. Right now, we have some kids who have lots of relationships with lots of people, the sort of kids everybody likes. And we have another group, maybe 30% of kids who have no relationships with anybody. And so we have real inequity in who has relationships with whom. So how do we begin to think more holistically about providing all young people with some relationships and providing different kinds of relationships with everybody? It doesn't take tons of time to do all that because we're not talking about counseling relationships with every kid. We're talking about how do we provide a web of relationships with every kid. So that would be one answer. And yes, it does take time. And so we could talk about that too.
Great. Also, a number of people probably came in a little bit after our opening, and so I'm getting several queries about how people are going to get this handout you keep referring to. So why don't you tell them about that now?
Too late. No, I'm kidding. At the end of the presentation, I'll put up a web address where you can link to it, and we'll send a handout to anybody who wants it.
Terrific. Just one more, and then we'll let you move on. There's a question about whether there's a differentiation between parent, family, or others in the faith community who are developing relationships.
Um, so what I would say is yes, different people who have different connections to a young person have different levels of relationship, different responsibilities in relationship. I, as a parent, have a different responsibility to my two sons than my neighbors do or their teachers did. What I would say though is we all do each of these things at some level. So the way I express care to my sons is very different and it better be very different than how For example, a coach might express care to them. But that doesn't mean you can't do all of those things in some degree with all of the with different young people. So yes, they are different in how you do them. Doesn't mean you can't do all of those different dimensions.
Terrific. Do you want to take time for one more, or do you want to move on?
Sure, we can one more just
Okay,
for
one
fun.
more. Someone's wondering if you've done any work on broken relationships and how they fit into this framework.
We haven't, although I think there's some stuff we could talk about that around how do you heal broken relationships? Where do you start? How do you deal with young people who have um, been scarred by systems, and where do you rebuild trust? Because to me, that's where it has to start. And so one of the ways we talk about it is which of the 5 elements do you lead with in a broken relationship? Where it might be we want to start with care, and like a kid who's been in a system and we've done some work in, for example, foster care. So how do you start with care and giving a kid voice and power because they've had none of that? It's all been taken away. Maybe not with starting with challenging growth, so that they find a voice and they find a way to build trust, because that's often what's been missing. So there's things like that you can start thinking about. So that's a longer story, and much more work needs to be done on that.
All right, well, I'm going to pop out and let you continue forward then. Thanks, Gene.
Okay, sounds good. And I'll pop back in on the screen. Um, if I can make this all work. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Okay. Um, So let's move to the second question of who is responsible for cultivating, maintaining this kind of relationship with youth. And we kind of began that actually, the conversation in just the few moments ago. And when the question about is there a difference between relationships of different people. So I want to actually introduce very quickly a study we commissioned with Frameworks Institute. Some of you may know them. They're a think tank communications research place in DC that's really a fascinating group. I'm not going to spend the rest of my time plugging them. But part of what they do is they look at what we know from research is important in any particular given area and how the public thinks about it and how we bridge those gaps through messaging and testing messages about that. What we did was we asked them to say, we know that people have been talking about the importance of relationships for a long time, and that we're not seeing a lot of movement in terms of changes in that. So for example, the mentoring field has been talking about relationships for a long time, and yet we're still seeing sort of a plateau in terms of engagement in mentoring, just as an example. So we asked them to say, how do the public think about relationships with outside the family with young people in particularly the teen years? And so they went out on the street, interviewed people, talked to them about when you think of this stuff, what do you think, and all of that. And what they discovered is the mental model that the vast majority of people they interviewed in across different cultural groups, and again, there's always exceptions, and we could spend a lot of time on that, was that the public think about relationships for young people almost as exclusively in terms of the home environment. Is who has responsibility for kids? It's the parents, sometimes the teachers a little bit. And they don't see other relationships as being really critical. And frankly, if the parents screw up, then that's the parents' fault and there's not much anybody else can do about it. And frankly, that's really sobering for those of us who've spent a career talking about the importance of a web of relationships in young people's lives. And saying that all of our work as youth workers, teachers, all of this other stuff that we've been trumpeting that these other relationships matter. And most of the public, people on the street, don't get it, don't see it, don't believe it, not in their heart. I mean, not off the top of their heads. And so part of our challenge is to say, if that's what people think, how do we think about that? And frankly, that isn't our experience if we stop and think about it. And so part of what we've done here is to say, how do we begin to change that assumption? And if you think about that in your own congregations, who's responsible for kids, really, in the church? So I'll just leave that with you. But let's start with the poll. So we're going to ask you, who is really responsible for maintaining relationships with youth? But we're going to start with the poll. So go to this website, menti.com, on a phone or on another window on your browser, something like that. And all of you can do this. It's a commercial site. You're not going to have to pay anything. But if you put in your email at the end, you'll get a copy of this whole presentation deck, including all the results from this poll. So people have a lot of fun with it. When you get there, and I go to the next slide, right up to right up to 5 people from any time in your life, and their connection to you in terms of how they've been instrumental in helping you grow in your faith. So 1 person per line, and you'll understand it when you get there. So I'll go to the next slide. When you're done, don't close the app. You can just wait for it to come up because we'll do a couple more of these down the way. So, write in the not the names but the roles. So if it was a pastor, parent, teacher, garbage collector, male person, it could be anybody who've nurtured your faith at some point in your life. Just type in their role in your life in one of the 5 lines that has shown up for you, and put it in there. And when you get done, enter that, and we'll see what kind of people. So, and then you can look up at my screen when you're ready, and you'll begin to see a word cloud starting to form based on the folks who are in the audience today. Very interesting. Starting to fill out a little bit. And as you'll see, that pastors, teachers, parents, Sunday school teachers, and some of these we combine if we were doing a real analysis of this, but Mentimeter doesn't know how to do that. So you get a lot of different examples: friends, family, brother-in-law, grandmother, all things that you would often see. I'll let it keep going here for a bit. Different kind of parents: youth directors, Sunday school teachers, campus ministers, confirmation elders, piano teacher, colleague. Just keep going and going. So, but you get the idea. From our perspective, we think, as you've experienced, that there's many different people who have a role. You can keep going. Who have a role in nurturing our faith at different times in our life, and for each of us, it's different, and it's important that we recognize that and see that. And this is true for the young people in our study as well. They could name lots of different people who they named, and yeah, some people are going to come up over and over, just as they have here: pastors, friends, a parent, a youth pastor sometimes will come up a lot. All of the kind of things that we've talked about. Some of the research that's been done focuses a lot on grandparents and their roles in faith formation. Lots of different people. And sometimes then, though, as we think about it in congregations, what we've done is we've assumed that it's just the one person we put in the formal role. And so how do we begin to broaden beyond that? So I'm gonna move us on a little bit. I think it'll stay open if you keep going. But just to keep us going, we did in our focus groups. We asked kids the same kind of thing. We asked them who they picked up on, and if you have a kind of a mental model of what's on the screen now, and you'll see actually a very similar kind of thing. We did this a similar word cloud out of our focus group data, and you see some of the same kind of folks coming up in their word cloud. Out of this, we actually asked young people to say, who was some of these people who you would say really made a difference, and can we talk to them? And so we went and talked to what we called exemplars. I mean, it's sort of an odd term, but it's what we use in social sciences, of people who they said were really important to them. And we went and interviewed those folks about what their relationship was like with these young people who were in our study. And what was interesting is they're a wide range. Again, this is only about 27 folks, because it's not a huge, like a random sample of the United States. But it did begin to show that all of these different people are part of the web of faith influencers in the lives of our kids, and just in this study in these 13 congregations. And yet, so begin to think about it. Our mental frame is, who are the people who are responsible for nurturing faith and for nurturing our young people? We tend to think it's parents and youth workers, maybe the pastor, depending on the size of the congregation. And yet, it's all of these other people that we personally can name who played those instrumental roles, important roles, formative roles. And what would happen if congregations really took that seriously? So how do we begin to remember, reframe who's responsible, who has a role to play in faith formation for our kids? So that's our second question. Our third question is, why do we do this? Why do we focus on building relationships with youth? And frankly, most of the times I hear people talking about this, excuse me, mostly focus on the tactical or utilitarian reasons. So we're going to skip those today. We're going to focus a little bit on theological reasons, which we heard from our advisors, and then some of the empirical reasons, which is really what the young people focused on. It's what they talked about. So theological reasons. I'm not going to read all these quotes. I'll let you read some of them again. When you'll have access to this presentation, you can read them again. So I just read a couple of these. I'll read the shorter ones because I'm just for time's sake. Relationships reflect the very nature of God, and relationship with God is how we understand faith. Muslim quote around that can't do religion, you can't practice faith without being in relationship. From Bob McCarty at the National Federation of Catholic Youth Ministries, retired now. My relationship with God has to be expressed and lived out in some way with my relationship with my neighbor. More quotes from various people talking about incarnation. Sarah Farmer says, to be walking among us and to be with us and to identify with us. I'm talking about the incarnation. That's still so closely related to even how we think about liberation and freedom. So you get the idea. I won't belabor it, but you get the idea. For everyone we talk to, all 20 advisors, there's a sense that relationship is embedded in our theologies across these three traditions, and I'm sure others as well. And it's at the center of all we're doing and how we think about our faiths. And frankly, even in the congregations, I should say, even in the congregations, there's also many who are quite articulate in thinking about why relationship focus is so important from a theological perspective as well. And different reasons, very different articulations about it. One of the Muslim scholars in our panel talked about how all of the prayers are in the no prayers use singular pronouns. They're all in the plural pronouns because we pray in the plural, which I found just a fascinating window on how you think about relationships and faith. So. For us, if we think about the why, I think we do have a utilitarian sense of why we do relationships oftentimes in youth ministry. It's an attraction model. People come to youth group, frankly, because they want to be with their friends, and we want to have a congregation to be friendly, so it'll attract people, so we'll get more people to show up. I think we need to reframe that to say that those relationships are essential for nurturing their faith and spiritual lives, their identities as people of God, and for their sense of purpose and calling. So reframing, yeah, maybe it will help more people show up. That's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because this is essential and central to our identity as communities of faith. So out of our data with young people, we identified 5 areas that they talked about that are sort of areas that faith is nurtured for them. And we can sort this some other ways. We have sorted other ways. These stood out to me as I was looking at this weekend. And as we move into other phases of the research, we'll do some more different ways of analyzing it and drawing correlations between things. For right now, this is just a way to look at it. So through those relationships, we asked them, out of these relationships, how has that affected your faith and your sense of who you are and your life? And so I'll go through these fairly quickly. They talk about it deepens my faith commitment. I have a strong relationship with God. Committed to carrying out religious traditions, inspired to participate in the faith community. It helps my religious literacy or confidence. I feel like I can learning about my faith. I'm developing language. I can communicate with people from other traditions. All of those kind of things. I get comfortable with the language of faith. Um, I can integrate my faith in life and make choices that are aligned with my faith. It's helping me know who I am. Um, Developing faith or spiritual identity, sort of that sense of that core identity, sense of agency. I know who I am and who I'm becoming through those relationships. It helps me internalize that. Um, and then it develops that sense of well-being and social emotional confidence where I can communicate, empathize, respect others, be resilient, and bounce back when I'm having struggling. So all of these kind of things that we would hope and expect would be part of a well-rounded faith and experience of faith and living abundance are all things that young people say are things that come out of those relationships that they have. So I went through that fast, but we'll just have you do another quick poll. So out of those people you talked about earlier, the 5 people, 5 people that you brought up, think about just rank order those 5 things that we threw down. How much did those people influence each of these 5 things for you? Just sort of rank over which was the biggest area they influenced you to the least area. And I know this is always unfair to rank order, but it's just a poll. So have some fun with that and just think through those 5 areas. Where do you think those people have the most influence, and where maybe down to the one where there's the least influence? We'll just see what happens. I like just watching bars move around, so it's kind of fun. And I know I'm with a lot of seminary people, so we could spend a lot of time defining those categories, but we'll do that another day. Okay. We're starting to take shape here. Kind of makes sense. Identity questions right into the top. It makes sense that our identities are shaped through our relationships and our integration of faith in life, which is something young people talked a lot about, something they value through those relationships. So I like it. It's fun to see what you guys are thinking about. So we can have a long conversation about what folks did that you remembered that particularly was influential in each of these areas, how they did that, when that happened, what you were going through at that time, what was significant about it, um, and how you see that happening. So again, I think you can keep responding to some of those as we move forward, but we're going to keep moving along here. I also just want to note that the impact of relationships goes beyond the impact on individuals, that relationships it's not just about one helping each kid, it's also about community. Faith Communities Today, the Faith Communities Today study released an analysis of what they did. They went and interviewed folks, and they found that vital congregations, in the definitions they used, I won't go into that one of the 3 core conditions of a strong vital congregations was having strong, respectful, loving relationships among the leaders and between the leaders and between the leaders and the community. Those 3 were all a core part of what made those congregations vital congregations. And so again, I think remembering that we're not just trying to nurture each young person by themselves, but it's also a communal experience, that it's both and in this case. So this was just a reminder of that for me, that it's both and. The next question, when are faith nurturing relationships nurtured? And sometimes we say confirmation and then they leave, so that's all we need to do. I'm kidding, of course, but obviously faith nurturing is a lifelong question, and sometimes we think it's happening during programs and rituals, and the reality is it doesn't really have a timeline. It can happen lots of different times and lots of different places. And I want to use just a metaphor that kind of gets at this. Um, there, and I'm struck by these because it sort of shapes the way we think about it. Um, Sometimes we use the images of carpenters that it's our job to shape young people to be the kind of people we believe God intends them to be, and that's one way of looking at it. Another metaphor that's used a lot is we pass on the faith. We have it and we need to share it with our children, and so we make sure that they get it, and we spend a lot of time thinking about that. Um, the metaphor that I find most useful in the context of relationships is to think about we nurture the relationships through relationships. We nurture the faith that the spirit that's in their spirit and help them cultivate it in places where they can grow. Um, and then how do we how do we develop the skills to be effective at nurturing those those seedlings and helping them grow and mature in the world? And so for me, those metaphors actually really matter, um, because when we think about carving, it's about figuring out how we give shape to what's there. And we think about passing, it means we have it and we're giving it to them. And this is that something, a seedling is planted. It has its essence in what it is, and then how are we helping to nurture and grow what's there. So they're very different images to think about. And so how do we use those and think about those, and what does that mean for how we approach faith development? And so those are all quite important. I think it's really interesting to use metaphors and think about that. Where does faith nurturing relationships occur? Um, and I think we've typically depended on youth programs, maybe Sunday school and the home to do that. I don't think that's adequate anymore, if it ever was. Um, and so let's look at that from three perspectives. Um, First of all, within the congregation, it's not just in youth group. It's got to be seen throughout congregational life. Um, and that's really a critical part. I know a lot of people are talking about that and working on that, and there's some great models emerging about that and thinking about that. I also, as a person steeped in developmental psychology and some of the world of that, I understand that young people's lives are being formed everywhere they spend time. This is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. Don't have to worry about that, but the idea there is everywhere the kids spend time, they're being influenced. It's also influencing their faith. So how do we begin thinking about and accompanying young people to make meaning of how their life is happening everywhere? And how do we begin to, as adults and as their peers, develop the skills to help them make meaning of their life experiences through the lens of their faith? And one of our advisors was Lena Thompson on this project, pastor in Washington State. And I just found this quote from our interview to be intoxicatingly interesting to me as she described how her congregation works in the Seattle area. So I'm actually going to read this one. For the young people in our congregation, and not just our congregation, but our community, what we're constantly doing here is trying to erase that line that often happens in Christians and churches. There's us and there's you. Even young people who we're connected to that are not part of the congregation, they know that the reason they feel connected with us is because we're centered in their story, their community, their issues of migration, immigration, housing, and education. All those things in those systems that are broken. And because of their brokenness, they're having an impact on our young people. And so everything she's doing is about spending time in the community, being part of the community, and then the curriculum within the congregation and their education and all of that is built around what's happening in the community, reflecting on that, and sort of reflexive processes of saying, what is God telling us about what's happening in this place and what our calling is in this place? To me, that's a really fascinating model of what it means to be connected and living out in the community and bringing faith to the community and to the young people's lives in the community. Then the third perspective is, where is it happening and where does faith develop? You could argue that relationships can grow anywhere, just like a tree can grow anywhere. It can put down roots almost anywhere, even on rock. And this is sort of the idea that, yeah, kids can grow up anywhere, they can be resilient. But what happens if we begin to change the ecosystems? If we begin to really create environments in our congregations, in our communities where faith can not just get by and survive, but it can thrive. So that brings us to our final um, question is how do we create congregations that are relationship rich? How do we create ecologies in congregations where kids can really grow and thrive in their faith? And so um, how do we create that? And so that's really where we're going to, we pulled stuff together from all of this and really where we need to begin thinking about our last questions here. I know we're getting short on time, but we got to have some fun with this. So go to back to your other screen and begin to answer these questions. There'll be two sets of polls. We'll do them in order here, and then we'll be pretty close to wrapping up here. So thinking about your own congregation, wherever you attend or frequent, and answer these three questions. You'll answer each question, about each one, two different ways. One is how important is that to you personally to be true about your congregation, and then how true is it of your congregation? And there's a scale that goes from the middle point, which is 0 to not important to very important, and then very true and not true. And so some of you are starting to figure that out. There's 3 questions there. So you begin to see those moving around. We can watch the moving dots like on old TV shows. So it takes a little longer, a little more complicated. So you'll see that for many people, it's these three questions. It's all everybody's on average saying it's quite important, very important to them, and less likely to say the church is it's very true of the congregations that they're currently part of. That may change as different people get their responses in. And so what we're trying to do here is to begin to say these may be some of the factors. We're testing this. These may be some of the factors of what things that you can do in a congregation that can help a congregation be more intentional about how it nurtures relationships. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this. It's going to kind of stalling here to let folks get a little more time to vote. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next one. I'm hoping some of you can still continue. I forgot how the system works. So the next question has 3 more questions, same kind of idea. So you can vote on these, and we'll give that a couple minutes, and then we'll wrap up the final few slides. Same basic idea around youth contributions, families, and community partnerships. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep us going. We had sort of the same patterns for those. We could play a little bit more to see what that was about. But the similar idea on many of these is, and we're seeing this in different places we spend time, is we're seeing a lot of people saying that, yeah, this stuff matters to me, and I'm not necessarily seeing it happening as much as I'd like. So, how do we begin to address that? And by the way, we do have a survey we're working on like this. And if you want to test the longer survey that has this and some other stuff in it, when I put up the slide at the end that has a web address, you can actually sign up to get that sent to you, and you can look it out and try it out if you really enjoy this stuff. And it'd be great to have you do that for us. So we'll do that at the end. But the idea here is some of these things, as we look through them, are important to some congregations, some are not important to others, and that's okay. But how do we begin to understand what's important, what matters in our congregation, in our community, and then how do we begin to focus on that? So begin to focus on that through. So we do have this assessment tool. We're going to finishing it up this month. There's still some time. If you do it, then you can win a gift card. So that's shameless plug for that. But you could do that if you have kids in the teenagers in the family. Once you've done yours, you can send them a link with you giving them permission to do it, and they can get it as well. So that's all there. Um, so, like I said, those results, if you at the end of the poll, which I'll shut down in a minute here, if you enter your email address, you can get that sent to you. So we have these 6 areas of congregational life that matter. I'll go through these very quickly. You'll get them, and they're also in the handout if you get that. One is around how do you create a congregation-wide commitment. Some of the things the kids and leaders talked about was sort of a rigorous self-reflection where you're consistently looking to improve, thinking about how your budget reflects those commitments. Where one of the leaders said, we're not allowed to say, okay, it didn't work, we tried. What are we trying next? So this ongoing sense of improvement, thinking critically about who's included, who's excluded, and how are we going to begin to make the place a little more like we want it to be. Being inclusive and welcoming and non-judgmental. Young people, this is a really big part of what makes a congregation a place that they value. This is the first church one of the young people said I've been to where they're welcoming of anyone who wants to come, and there's an intentionality about it. Embracing intergenerational community, both on the site and in these immersive experiences, where there's more and more conversation about when everybody's so busy, maybe setting aside for time for an overnight or a camp for the families together, or other kind of intergenerational experiences, maybe some of the best time to address that issue that Karen Marie, the question came up, how do we find the time, is not trying to do it on 10 minutes here and there, but to have those immersive experiences. Some places, by the way, that's not as possible because of socioeconomic barriers where families can't get away like that. Engaging young people as leaders and contributors where they're seen and heard, they have those opportunities for leadership development, so that they're engaged with other leaders in terms of those relationships happening and them being in those roles as well. So the young people know that from the minute they're born, they're important and they are seen and heard in this place. Partnering with families in terms of building trust with them, the diversity families, equipping them to build those relationships at home, and then building support among families. Many families, particularly at the adolescent years, feel like they have no one to talk to about their stuff. And that's true of families and congregations that we interviewed. Many of them had not talked with any other parents in the congregation since their children were little. Growing relationships in the community, partnerships in the community. How do we begin to really connect with the larger community? As Lena was describing, if you're not part of the community, how do you actually know what the lived experience is in those communities? So then in the end, and this is in the handout, it's probably the most thing people value the most, is how do we begin thinking about both helping individuals build relationships, those well-rounded relationships. On the handout, we have ideas for what individuals could do in nurturing those individual relationships. And then how do we help congregations as a whole begin changing the culture? nurturing those practices, leadership, the kind of things we were just talking about in the survey, in the quiz. How do we begin doing both so that your individuals are moving forward and getting more intentional about relationships, and the congregation is changing the culture at the same time? And so that's really, as we're looking at our work moving forward, is how do we do that? How do we begin moving to those places where there's both the tips for how individuals, youth, parents, clergy, and all adults can begin thinking about how they express care, how they challenge growth, how they expand possibilities, and how we begin engaging in each of those elements of a relationship-rich congregation as a communal body. And then finally, as we begin to look to the next phase of our work at Search Institute, we want to begin thinking through a change process of how we listen, reflect, plan, launch, begin to create the systems, and then celebrate growth and change over time, where congregations actually become relationship rich over time through their own innovation, tapping their own gifts and talents and strengths, so that we actually begin to see transformation happening. So I think I burned through all of our time, Karen Marie, which I apologize for that. But I do have the website down at the bottom there if people want um, to get follow-up information, or to get the handout, do the survey, or anything else you want to do. So
Let's go ahead, and I think we can take a couple of questions from the list that's been appearing in the Q&A. So I'm going to offer a couple of those, and we'll go until about 10:10 so that we can fit those in. One question that's been asked is there an age that by which this broader web of relationships has to be developed for there, or there will be too much impact from not having it in place?
um, I would say it's earlier the easier the earlier it's done, but I would say I would never give up. I think um, I think that there's work being done now with senior citizens to reconnect them with a web in their in their in their senior communities, so that they have a richer life in retirement. So I guess I'm not willing to say you stop just because there's not one there.
That's, I would agree. So here's another one that's kind of a technical problem that a lot of congregations probably experience. A questioner says, a challenge we face at our church is how we create opportunities for intergenerational relationships that have depth while still preserving our child protection policies. What advice do you have for that balance?
Um, I think first of all, it's very important to have the child protection policies. So we'll start there. I would say encouraging intergenerational relationships primarily in open spaces where people can see each other. So you don't have to go off in private, off in somewhere where everybody has to go through that. You can start those relationships in an open fellowship hall where people can talk and be very open. And it doesn't have to be one-on-one relationships. It can be in groups. So there are ways within the child protection policies to have people get to know each other that's not one-on-one mentoring relationships off somewhere else. And in fact, good relationships happen in groups as well as they happen in one-on-one pairings.
And I think related to that, or maybe building on that, someone asked, how do we reimagine ways to bring back the idea that it takes a community, not just the nuclear family, to raise or support children and youth? So perhaps you could give us some more ideas about how we do that sort of community engagement.
Right. I mean, part of it is, there's like so much we need to think about with that. I think part of it is beginning to um, rethink relationships as we all need them. And I mean, part of the reason I asked you to think about all the people who nurtured your faith was to help remember who's been there for you. And so we do a lot of that, of remembering who is there for you, to remember you already have a village, and to help people remember that for themselves. Um, and so part of it's just changing the mindset for folks as a starting point. And then part of it's about creating spaces where people can enter into community where it's not awkward. Right now, it is so awkward that you don't know what to talk about. you don't know if who's going to be there. And so we spend a lot of time helping people just getting comfortable, getting into spaces where they don't think they're going to know anything or they're going to look stupid, getting comfortable in that space.
That's really helpful. And I'm seeing a number of comments in our chat about how people appreciate the very concrete ideas that you're giving. So thank you so much. Um, I just want to note for all of you who are watching and listening that at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, all of our lecturers, Jean, Evelyn, and Alan, will join us for a panel discussion that's going to explore intersections among their presentations, and they'll also be responding to some of the questions that you've been posing that we haven't gotten to, as well as others that might come up at that time. As we conclude this Zoom session with Dr. Roehlkepartain, please join me in a prayer of thanksgiving and benediction. Invisible and yet present God, although we cannot see you, we know that you are in our midst. Thank you for the gifts of Gene, Search Institute, and this compelling research on the power of intentional relationships. Thank you for the relationships that make up our lives and nurture our faith, even in this time of social distancing. Reveal to us the blessings of this time as clearly as we see the frustrations and pain. Be for us our God, and we will be your people. Amen. Hope to see you at 11. Bye.
Thank you.